People who are driving the desire for more Sharia in this country are not the progressive Muslims.
Well,
they are people who are the most regressive Muslims in the Muslim community here.
In this video, we shall be looking at this highly controversial topic as to whether we should or shouldn't embrace Sharia law.
Sharia law is the legal code based on the Islamic holy book, the Quran, which governs how Muslims live their everyday lives. There are no official Sharia courts in the UK, but there are councils and tribunals which are used to settle civil disputes. And the government announced in the summer for the first time that some of these hearings now operate under the Arbitration Act. That means their rulings are enforceable through the UK court system. And Alexander reports on how the system has been working.
This is a Sharia council in progress in the UK. Senior Muslim clerics sort out civil issues amongst Muslims, such as granting religious divorces, in accordance with the ancient code based on the Quran. Sharia law hearings in this country aren't new, but what is new is this network of official tribunals which are recognised under British law. Any agreement which is come to in the courts of arbitration is enforceable in the civil courts.
The Muslim Arbitration Tribunal deals with a whole wide remit of issues, from commercial disputes, civil disputes, mosque disputes, neighbours disputes, communal disputes. We do not get involved in any criminal cases. But the only sort of remit that we're looking at the moment, and we're discussing it with the authorities like the CPS and the police at the moment, is where we desire to give in the case of domestic violence, primarily it's a woman, I mean sometimes it is a man as well, the opportunity to look at an alternative form of resolution of the matter.
Back at the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal's headquarters, Sheikh Siddiqui sees no conflict between Sharia and the secular legal system.
In the instance of Muslim Arbitration Tribunal, it's not a parallel legal system. We are sitting within the English legal system under the Arbitration Act, not as a parallel legal system.
Well, Geoffrey Robertson is still with us, and also we're joined now by writer and commentator Douglas Murray. Thanks very much for coming in. If I can start with you, as a top lawyer, how comfortable are you with Sharia being brought into the fold, as it were?
Geoffrey Robertson does touch on and highlights why some elements of the Sharia law really isn't compatible within the UK judicial system.
Well, comfortable-ish. It's being brought into the fold under the Human Rights Act, and you can appeal from these arbitration tribunals, which have one Muslim lawyer and one academic, to the courts, and I think that's very important. Beth Din has had this system for Jewish people for many years, and there are worries because there are aspects of Muslim law that simply do not, are unacceptable. The dealings with women, the idea that women should inherit only half the property and that men should, their testimony is worth more than women. Those aspects of Sharia are incompatible with our legal...
Well, but then do you not see a potential for a clash? I mean, you can't cherry-pick the beliefs you want.
And I think this is the important thing, at the end of the day, there is a potential for compromise, and there is a potential for renuancing Sharia law so that it is more compliant with human rights. And I think because these tribunals are within the system, and because you can, the courts can overrule them, I think there is a real possibility that they will be, in the long run, helpful.
Right, and there is the safety net. If one doesn't like what the Sharia arbitration suggests, there is UK law to fall back on, so what's the problem?
Well,
now Douglas gets into his stride and highlights some real potential problems and truths.
You'd hope that there was, but sadly that doesn't seem to be always the case. The Sharia court featured in your film, the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal, has, by its own admission, heard 6 cases that really have strayed from the civil into the criminal. 6 women who were abused and who, instead of being referred to the police by the MAT, had their cases overheard by the MAT. Another case was a Muslim man who died, didn't leave a will. The MAT decided to arbitrate his will according to Sharia, so the daughters got half of the money for their brothers. So the question here here is not just whether, in the words of Sadiq Khan, the MP who said last month, asked whether or not the Muslim community in Britain is sophisticated, was his word, enough to have a parallel legal system, but also who's driving it. And sadly, and I've seen this many times, spoken to people who run these courts, the people who are driving the desire for more Sharia in this country are not the progressive Muslims.
Well,
they are people who are the most regressive Muslims in the Muslim community here.
Taking your point.
Douglas really does have a very valid point.
But isn't it just too late? It's a well-rehearsed argument. We had this when we talked about faith schools. If Beth Din is allowed to exist in this country, on what premise can you say, well, you're fine, but you're not fine?
Well, in a way, it's a sort of it's an extra legal argument. Beth Din are voluntary, and you can decide whether or not to be arbitrated by them. The question I think we have to ask as a society is if we want parallel communities, which would actually be very hard for particularly women to actually volunteer for. Would the state, for instance, have any guarantee that a woman who a Sharia court said had volunteered for arbitration had volunteered for arbitration? I was in parts of the north of England last week, on the so-called no-go zones, speaking with women in particular whose lives have been ruined in some cases by the installation and the propulsion increase of Sharia law in this country. It's a question of whether or not they have volunteered. I don't think the state can make that decision.
Well, that's an important decision that we've got to, and I go along with you to this extent.
Very briefly, Mr.
I don't think there should be no involvement in the criminal law. You're quite right. The police should prosecute irrespective of any recommendation from one of these tribunals. Secondly, we need a special overseer. We need a special counsel to check that, first of all, that these cases which are in breach of the Human Rights Act, like the one you mentioned and I mentioned, of the giving women half the will, should be appealed, and to ensure that, in fact, those who are going through this parallel arbitration, which is faster than the courts, are really, the women are genuinely
I'm afraid
agreeable.
I'm going to have to bring the gavel down at that point, because we have run out of time, but thank you very much for being with us. Thank you.